So we transition from talking about some of the perceived negative effects of city life to looking at the true innovations, the awe, so to speak, looking at the spectacle, the idea of building up, this concept of skyscrapers. It really comes to pass in the aftermath of the Great Chicago Fire. No major American city had ever been completely wiped out, so this was a chance to do something new. Voters approved the construction of new public buildings, and construction was even so rampant that Chicago skipped the worst of the economic depression that the Panic of 1873 brought. Instead of building outward onto the prairies that surrounded the city, the Chicago Tribune declared that Chicago must build upward. Other major cities, such as New York and Philadelphia, had built tall structures, but since Chicago already had a clearly defined industrial and business district that they wanted to rebuild, their buildings were all right next to each other instead of spread out. Architect Louis Sullivan conceived of the skyscraper in 1890, and he was just one of numerous architects that firms competed with to hire. Now, for example, the Rookery had massive windows facing Lake Michigan, almost as if the lake was coming indoors. The Monadnock building, the first to be called a skyscraper, was a 10-story tall office building completed in 1892. And the Masonic Temple building that you see here at the time was the world's tallest office building, 22 stories. Interestingly enough, Chicago, very shortly after this, passed an ordinance banning buildings of more than 10 stories tall. Now, this was also made possible by Carnegie's innovations in cheap steel, so it was used in abundance. In 1852, Elisha Otis actually perfected the safety brake elevators, so buildings could not only go higher, but people could traverse them. And often elevators would attempt to emulate a higher-end style when they transported their guests. So we have the concept of skyscrapers. The Statue of Liberty was a gift from France in 1876 to commemorate the Declaration of Independence, and they agreed to pay for it as long as Americans would fund its construction and build a platform on which to rest it. Fundraising the construction kind of came at a standstill and nearly fell through until newspaperman Joseph Pulitzer of the New York World announced a drive to raise the necessary money. He stated that anybody who donated money towards construction would have their names printed in his newspaper, and over 120,000 answered the call. Most gave less than $1, and the 305-foot Statue of Liberty was formally completed in 1886. Now, staying with this idea of New York spectacle, what's now the borough of Brooklyn was not formally part of New York City during this time. And, only a ferry would travel between Brooklyn and Manhattan, so a bridge was viewed as essential. The resulting Brooklyn Bridge opened in 1883, connecting the boroughs of Manhattan and then the city of Brooklyn, and it was nicknamed the Eighth Wonder of the World. It was the first steel wire suspension bridge ever constructed, and it was formally named in 1915. It at first was called the New York and Brooklyn Bridge, understandably so. Construction took 14 years. It cost $15.5 million and led to 27 deaths. When it first opened, rumors that the bridge was going to collapse ran rampant. You can see that clearly pedestrians were traversing it. These rumors were laid to rest when P.T. Barnum, never the one to miss out on publicity, organized a crossing of 21 of his elephants, thus proving it was safe and could bear heavy loads. The bridge itself spans almost 6,000 feet. By comparison, the Golden Gate Bridge, another steel wire suspension bridge, is nearly 9,000 feet. So in these cities, spectacle is rampant. Getting people from place to place was also an issue because congestion was viewed as a massive problem. At the end of the Civil War, most cities had two options. Either horse-drawn carriages, which are kind of seen as unpleasant, or steam-driven railroad cars, which are loud, crowded, and noisy. The idea of an underground railway system was first attempted in the late 1860s in New York, and it did enjoy some practical success, but business owners complained that their foundations had been dug out, so the idea was scrapped. It wasn't until the Great Blizzard of 1888, where everything above ground came to a standstill, that there was a perceived need to have underground mass transit. Boston's operation opened up in 1897, which was the first in American history, but the New York system, first called the Interborough Rapid Transit System, was more well known, and it's the most heavily traveled subway system in the world. Now, in addition to going underground, there were obvious above-ground innovations. A New Yorker named Charles T. Harvey had wanted to build an elevated railway system to transport people throughout the city, and he used cables instead of locomotives to drive the cars. The cable car systems, complete with pulleys, was completed in New York in 1872, and other cities followed suit. Although about a decade and a half later, the system of electric cars pioneered in Richmond was copied all over the world. San Francisco, so you see the San Francisco trolley here? They were pretty much the only major city not to replace its cable car system. So we're traveling underground, we're traveling above ground, and we're traveling way above ground. 1903, the first heavier-than-air flight was made by the Wright brothers in Kitty Hawk, North Carolina. These are Midwestern brothers who had previously operated a bike shop. Orville's first flight lasted 12 seconds, and less than 1 decade later, nations were already using this new invention for reconnaissance and other military uses during World War I. So we don't get too much into personal air travel during our time frame, but the innovation is there. Now we've got the spectacle, we have transportation. People are going to start having more time on their hands. So we have this concept of parks. And in the United States, there were 4 phases of what we would call urban parks. In the 1800s, cities began buying land on the outskirts of cities so that their industrial workers could kind of relax in nature. And this proved to be a good contrast to their industrial reality. Phase 2, as cities built out and they developed around these green spaces, the land was upgraded and included places such as golf courses, zoos, and museums, so residents would have something to do. Phase 3, early 1900s, parks were built that included swimming pools, playgrounds, and civic buildings. And this had the purpose of allowing people of multiple classes to interact, but also keep in mind that there are large numbers of immigrants that are in the United States, so this was seen as helping to Americanize immigrants. And finally, phase 4, parks became a bit more residential, and they were meant to house different leagues and other buildings for all age levels, things like shelters. The first major urban park can be seen here. We're taking a look at Central Park, designed in 1857 by Frederick Law Olmsted. Within this 843-acre park that's on the upper west and east sides of Manhattan, you can clearly see there's a large pool of water in the middle, but he built in specific pathways for carriages, and these pathways for carriages would easily be converted to roads once cars came around. So with leisure time, we can go to parks, and we can also document life and leisure. Photographs were initially an expensive process, and only highly trained professionals, like Matthew Brady during the Civil War, could attempt it. But George Eastman's Kodak Company perfected the Kodak Brownie in 1888. It went on the market a little while later. It was shaped like a box and was intended to be used by all, turning photography into a leisure activity, although this does take a little bit of time. In addition to documenting through still pictures, there's film, moving pictures. An early film was made solely of celluloid, which was highly flammable. But Thomas Alva Edison and his research company developed the standard 35mm gauge, and produced thousands of films, and most of them are in the public domain. All you have to do is go to YouTube and you can get a glimpse at what life was like well over a century ago.